I'll give a little introduction about Good Grief Network, our event today, and introducing Dr. Panu, our wonderful researcher joining us today. So, Good Grief Network is a peer support nonprofit organization with programs serving individuals and communities experiencing eco distress and collective trauma from social and ecological injustices. We're recognized for our flagship program, 10 Steps to Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate. And we create spaces where folks can lean into dialogues about painful feelings about the state of the world and reorient our lives towards meaningful action. My name is Julie Souza. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the development coordinator here at Good Grief Network, and I'm joined by my co-facilitator, Laura Schmidt, who I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey folks, thanks for being here today. As I said just a few moments ago, I know that our attention is pulled in so many directions, and so I'm grateful that y'all are here. I'm grateful Julie's co-facilitating, and so grateful to have Panu here to talk about climate grief. I am Laura Schmidt. I'm one of the founders of Good Grief Network, and just really grateful to share space and learn more and feel more into these times. Back to you, Julie.
Thanks, Laura. And today we're also joined by Dr. Panu Pihkala, a climate emotions researcher with extensive knowledge of climate grief and other emotions. Dr. Panu, please share a little bit about yourself.
Greetings, everyone. Very glad that we have the opportunity to gather together here. Uh, Warm greetings from the Helsinki evening. So I'm based in Finland. It's 6 p.m. Now. I'm very glad about all the things that Good Grief Network has been doing over the years, and very glad also about this opportunity for cooperation. So I've been working with environmental teams for roughly 20 years. For my first kind of eco-anxiety workshop was around 2008 or 9, and it's been a long and winding road. And today I'm gonna talk about applying general grief research into ecological grief and climate grief, but more about that later. Very glad to be here with you.
Thank you, Panu. And before we get started with our community agreements, I'm just going to quickly introduce our Q&A feature. So at the end of the presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask questions and get to know a little bit more, go a little bit deeper. To drop those questions, feel free to use the Menti. If you have questions, anything technical though, like you can't see the presentation or you're having any sort of audio issues, feel free to use the Zoom meeting chat. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Laura for our community agreements.
Okay, thank you. Because we're going to be together in a few different ways today, we're going to engage probably in the chat and definitely in some breakout rooms just to have some space to explore the material a little bit deeper. We have to figure out ways to be with one another. And so we propose the following community agreements. The first one we call self-responsiveness or boundaried self-care. This means take care of yourself. Some of the material might be a little heavy for you to hold, and you might need to mute your camera, take a step back, use the restroom, take a bio break, get some water or tea. Do what you need to fully arrive and to be present with us or to take care of yourself. Our next request is that you respect the hosts, each other, and yourselves. We really like to come from a place of respect and honor in these spaces. The next one is an invitation to me. As much as anyone else, I talk fast, I move fast. And so if you're one of those folks who moves fast as well, it's an invitation to practice intentional slowness. We're going to fit a lot in this next little while. And so we'll take pauses. We'll try to go slow. And with that, we also request that if something arises where you feel a bit of tension or you don't like what's being said, we invite you to come back to a place of curiosity. Can you be curious with both what you're feeling and also with what's being presented? Can you stay open? Can you just look around with a bit of curiosity instead of judgment? Our next community agreement that we propose is to be mindful of what you say, either using your voice in the breakout rooms or through chat. And then you'll be in small groups. I believe we're going to do groups of 2 today. And so just create space. Make sure there's space for everyone to share. Be mindful of the space that you take up. Leave space for everyone to share. This is an important reminder for all of us, is that there are many valid ways for reacting to these chaotic times. And so if somebody is acting in a way that maybe you don't understand, maybe it's their way of moving through the world. And so just let's go back to that curiosity and openness with each other. Just know that there are many valid ways of reacting to this moment. And then finally, because we're talking about feelings, because we're talking about things that are quite personal, we ask that you practice confidentiality, which means that the stories themselves can leave this space, but no identifying features about the person. Don't say gender, don't say where they're from, don't say their name, don't identify the story with the person, but you can share the wisdom outside of this room. So hopefully we can all agree to these agreements. We can all keep on each other sort of in community in these ways, and we'll continue forward by doing a grounding exercise. All right, so we'll have a couple grounding exercises sprinkled throughout our time together. Grounding and being aware of our bodies are very, very big with Good Grief Network, and because we believe it's the best way to take in information. And so the 4-7-8 breathing exercise is one that we practice quite a lot. It's one that I personally practice quite a lot, and it's very, very good for anxiety. It's very good for bringing us back into the present moment. And so I'm going to talk you through this exercise. You are welcome to practice it with us, but I'm just a guide. If you notice that you're getting a little bit more activated, if this is not nourishing for you, then feel free to take the next few minutes and do something that does nourish you and that helps you arrive in this space. So the instructions for this grounding exercise are that you're going to breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. You're going to hold that breath for a count of 7. And then you're going to breathe out of your mouth for a count of 8. And I'm going to walk us through it twice in a row. And then we can resume our normal breathing pattern, and we'll do it twice again. So if you'd like to practice this with me, go ahead and breathe in through your nose for a count of 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out of your mouth for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, breathe in for 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Breathe out of your mouth 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, go ahead and just breathe normally for a second. Maybe you want to shake it out. Maybe you got a little tense during that time. We're going to do another 2 rounds. If you'd like to practice with us, I invite you to breathe in through your nose for 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Exhale 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Again, breathe in 2, 3, 4. Hold 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And breathe out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, again, this is just called 4-7-8 breathing. It's a way to kind of halt those ruminating thoughts, come back into the present moment. I invite you to shake it out or just kind of take a moment to yourself before we come back and rejoin as a group.
Thank you, Laura. Now I'm going to pass it along to Dr. Panu to walk us through the presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Julie and Laura, for all that important things we just did together. And I strongly recommend all of us to keep breathing calmly through the content. So this is an opportunity to be with knowledge and thoughts and emotions around ecological grief in the broader sense and climate grief related to anthropogenic global warming. And I'm going to speak in 3 parts, and after each part, which will be roughly 10 minutes, we'll have breakout rooms. So that's going to be the rhythm for approximately the next stages of our session. I'll start with a photo related to the substance matter and practical activities from Finland. So this is a funeral for an old growth forest, a little bit west from Helsinki, the capital of Finland, in 2015. And it's a testimony to one of the many creative ways in which people nowadays are engaging collectively with ecological damage and the shared emotions around that. So there is sadness and grief, and a big part of that is often moral outrage because of what is happening, and many other emotions may be involved also. In my academic work, I have been exploring various kinds of eco-emotions or climate emotions. Cooperation with the Climate Mental Health Network has led to the creation of the Climate Emotions Wheel, which can be handy in observing various emotions related to ecological and climate grief also. And today, the focus will be on types of loss and types of grief. And as Laura mentioned, there's so many reasons for sorrow and outrage in the contemporary world, as we all know. Today, the focus will be explicitly on ecological and climate change-related aspects, but of course, this is interconnected with a great number of social and political issues. So just wanting to name that out loud and also explain the explicit focus of my talk. Polycrisis emotions is one term that somebody has suggested in addition to eco-emotions or climate emotions. So polycrisis meaning the interweaving of various kinds of crises in the contemporary world. Our pain for the world comes from Joanna Macy and colleagues from their work that reconnects network, which has strong interweavings with Good Grief Network also. So there's a possibility to explore terminology which describes our emotions and feelings about the state of the world. Eco and climate words will be used mostly in this session. The grief researcher Darcy Harris has been exploring what she calls socio-political grief or political grief, and for grief about those areas in life and society, I strongly recommend her work. We will be weaving the cognitive and somatic together. The presentations will be cognitive in style, but I'll give you reflection questions often. So the major theme is applying knowledge from general grief research into ecological and climate grief. So grief and bereavement research is an old field, quite interdisciplinary one. I first studied it myself in the early 2000s when I was doing my master's in theology and religious studies, so that's part of my background. And then I've been working with people grieving the loss of close human persons in practice between 2005 and 2010, especially after returning to the university and focusing first on research on religion and ecology, and then for the last 10 and more years into ecological emotions. So it's been a deepening journey into various aspects of grief research and counseling, and some of my research from last years is application of those fields. Especially I'll today draw from this article called Ecological Sorrow, Types of Grief and Loss in Ecological Grief, which is fully available in that address, and later on you'll also get the links and slides. And here's a graphical abstract of that article, and there's a lot of information and a lot of images here, and I'm gonna talk about many of these, but not all of them. So the idea is sort of less is more, roughly. There's gonna be a lot still, but anyway. So I'll just mention before going into types of loss that if you want to listen to more discussions about these matters, There is this provocatively titled podcast I've been hosting for 4 years with environmental psychologist and therapist Thomas Doherty, who has a new book also coming out. So Climate Change and Happiness is our provocative title. What could be a good or meaningful life amidst the climate crisis, or is that possible? That's a sort of general topic, and we often discuss climate emotions, including grief. So that's found on the usual podcast platforms. So please keep notes if the terms I'll be talking about resonate with your experiences, or if you are puzzled by something, you got the Menti link from Julie in the chat. So part 1, the major emphasis will be on types of loss. The second part on types of grief. I'll explain the difference also a bit later. And part 3 looks on what is called meaning reconstruction and adversarial growth. So what that means we'll get to later on. And many things can be present at once. So I'll be showing images of a certain type of loss and certain type of grief. So I want to emphasize that they are not mutually exclusive. And very often our experiences of climate grief include many of those aspects. So wanting to be clear about that. So to part 1, focus on types of loss or parts of them. So loss is the interpretation of an event or a change as a loss. It may sound simple, but not everyone interprets all ecological damage as loss. And this already then causes social differences and often complicates ecological grief. For example, the felling of trees, which is a very common source of ecological grief in Finland. Some people see it mainly as an economic gain, and some people see it as an ecological loss, which then evokes grief. So that's a practical example of how the appraisals of what counts as loss may be widely different. Conflicting interpretations make ecological grief more difficult. I'll be talking about the social dimension often today, and we can discuss it more. And various kinds of grief are then responses to various kinds of loss. And they are often interweaved, but still, I would argue, together with grief researchers, that is often useful also sometimes to pay attention to types of loss and types of grief separately. From the perspective of various living creatures, including plants, trees, non-human animals, ecological damage can be total loss. In this presentation, the focus is on humans grieving ecological losses, but I want to emphasize that this can be shared across living beings, and there's lots of experiences that are experienced by others, and through empathy we can only approximate what it may be like. So the first of the concepts I'll share is this distinction between tangible and intangible loss. And this distinction can help to discern various forms of ecological loss. So tangible means something that you can see or in other ways observe with your senses, and intangible is something more abstract, something which may not be clear at first. So one option would be to talk about invisible aspects of losses. And there below the image, there's a phrase that intangible losses can be difficult to notice and are often disenfranchised. So this term disenfranchised grief is very relevant for ecological and climate grief. I'll come back to it, but basically it means that one doesn't receive as much support for one's grief as would be desirable. And there may be different intensities of this disenfranchisement, and there may be different forms of it. So but I'll come back to that. So if there are invisible aspects in losses, for example, loss of identity because of ecological loss of relationships, loss of emotional connections, sometimes loss of certain roles or of a certain status, for example, then those aspects may be more easily unobserved by others and unvalidated by others. And I think following many researchers like Petra Chakert, that there can be a profound array of various kinds of intangible aspects in ecological losses. And a single loss can include both tangible and intangible aspects. For example, the forests, of which I showed the photo in the beginning, which was dear to me also personally. There was the tangible loss. The forest is not there. You can see remnants of the trees lying on the ground and so on. And then there's the intangible, invisible aspects, including the loss of opportunities for being together, for example. So some reflection questions. What was the meaning of what is now lost or changed to me or to us, if the experience is collective? Was there emotional connections and bonds? Usually there are, and what kinds of? How was it connected with my or our identity? Does the loss change my role in some way? So these are now open questions. You may keep these in mind for the first breakout session, which we will rather soon join. But first I'll talk a bit about another concept, which is ambiguous loss. You can see the line, which is not constant, so that sort of tries visually to testify to ambiguity. So losses which have uncertainty and ambivalence can be called ambiguous loss. Pauline Boss is a major grief researcher coining this term. Classical example is grieving soldiers missing in action. So there is grief and sorrow, but there's also uncertainty about whether the soldier might be one day found, which then often complicates grieving. Many ecological losses have ambiguous elements, and there's a distinction between psychological presence or absence and physical absence or presence. There's actually a typo in the image I see now, it should be physical. So what this means is that the soldier who is missing in action, there is psychological presence still, but there's physical absence and unclarity about what will happen. Then, if you live near a person who suffers from dementia, for example, or Alzheimer's or other kind of memory disease, they are physically present, but they are psychologically absent, or at least mostly absent. They may have clear moments from time to time. So the presence and absence can function differently in relation to physical and psychological presence or absence. And in ecological losses, there's often various kinds of these elements. For example, in Finland, snowy winters have been partly lost due to climate change, especially in southern Finland. But then some winters we get lots of snow. And this makes grieving more difficult because there is real reason for grief, but also it's not clear always, and there's an uncertainty, unpredictability element, which often then increases also feelings of anxiety. So that's ambiguous loss and some reflection questions about it. Does my or our ecological grief include reactions to some ambiguous losses? If so, what kind of? How do others in my life react to ambiguous losses and or intangible losses? Do people in general realize them or validate them? Or is there more silence around them or even actual disenfranchisement? So with these questions in mind, and now especially thinking about two types of loss, intangible losses and ambiguous loss, I would invite Laura to lead us into the first part of the breakout groups. So please use this moment and chance to reflect on these types of loss and your own experiences and thoughts. What resonates? What would you like to share and explore with the person with you in the breakout group? Over to you, Laura, for any practical instructions if needed.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are going to put you in breakout rooms, but if you don't want to stay in a breakout room or go into a breakout room, you can stay in the main room and just reflect on these on your own. Definitely highly recommend that you join other folks in the breakout room. We're going to be in the rooms for 7 minutes. So this breaks down to about 3 minutes each. Please make sure that you're a bit mindful of time so that every person has a chance to reflect on these questions. I'm going to go ahead and open the breakout rooms. We're going to be in there with 2 people. So let me make sure that that happens real quick. Okay. All right. If you don't want to go into the breakout room, if you want to stay in the main room, just stay here. And then if there's somebody left over in the breakout room, we'll move you so that there's 2 people. I'm going to open the rooms now.
Welcome back to the main room. I hope you had a fruitful conversation with your partner or 2 other people in the breakout rooms, and I'd be very interested about insights in the breakout rooms. Our structure today is that we have the open Q&A and discussion after the 3 rounds of presentations and breakout rooms, but please remember that you can use the Menti for writing down questions and comments already at this point. So there's the link provided by Julie in the chat. So I'll move on to the second part, focusing more on types of grief. There will be information about types of loss also still. So there's various ways in which forms of grief or sadness or sorrow can be categorized or distinguished from each other. One is temporalities. I'll talk more about that soon. Another would be intensities. Third one would be in relation to social dynamics, and there could be more criteria named, but these are some of them. So here is an image about anticipatory grief. Some scholars define this as mourning in advance, before the losses have happened. But anticipatory grief can also be seen as part of grieving ongoing changes, which are estimated to gain stronger forms in the future. This is seen as a major aspect of ecological grief. It's related to continuing emotional bonds. So this term of continuing bonds is one which has been used growingly in grief research in the last decades. It's related to the fact that many people, when a loss happens, they don't want to cut off the emotional bonds with what is now lost, but instead there's a need to find new ways of living in relation and connection, even while there can be now physical absence. And if you think of the classic case of grief and bereavement, the death of a close person, that's one example of continuing bonds, which may then happen in practice via commemoration or memorializing. Many people have photos of dear deceased ones. People may light a candle at certain times of the year, for example, and many people feel still a connection or a presence. With ecological losses, this is partly more complex. There may be some ambiguity. For example, is the forest totally lost if it will regrow in 50 years or 100 years? I would strongly emphasize that there's very significant loss when an old crowd forest is felled down, but still there's also the new growth dimension. So temporalities are important to think about, and anticipatory mourning can sometimes be very important preparation for what is to come. So grief counselors advise that it's good to pay attention to signals about changes and losses. For example, if you live with an elderly person who starts showing signs of getting worse, that's a sort of final call to start really putting an effort in the relationship and upholding emotional bonds and so on. So that's the positive dimension. But of course, sometimes it can happen that anticipating losses feels terrible, and people may also end up in catastrophizing, feeling that things will be lost, which we don't know yet whether they will be lost. And disenfranchising grief may be part of this, because in social dynamics, there's often people overemphasizing the uncertainty, for example, in climate change related losses. So it's a tricky balance of trying to do constructive anticipatory mourning and preparation, or preparing for that possibility, and not going into overly strong anticipatory grief. One may also talk of transitional loss and grief. Ongoing changes can evoke sadness. Think of aging, for example. An adjustment is required, coming to terms with what is happening and letting feelings flow. Many ecological changes produce these kinds of loss and grief, and sometimes we have more information about this, and sometimes we observe it only later on. So in addition to anticipating something, there's the possibility of living in the midst of a transitional change, which then requires our attention. Yet one more important temporality and dimension is what is called non-finite loss in grief scholarship. So this can help to make sense of ecological losses. Some losses are more one-time losses, but then for some losses, there may be a realization of the loss, which then evokes or causes a stronger process of grief, but the loss may not go away completely. So there may be sort of wounds which open again, or reminders of that which has been lost and still continues to have an impact on our lives. So these are called non-finite losses. They easily generate anxiety, because there may be the uncertainty elements and sort of waiting for what will happen next and how intense the feelings will be. And there can be social tension around them, often resulting in disenfranchisement. There is also often a lack of rituals for non-finite and ongoing losses. It's not very common yet to have memory places or memorials for ecological and climate losses. There are luckily some. The monument to the passenger pigeon, for example, some other monuments for extinct species. In Iceland, there's the rather famous memory place for melting glaciers, but I would say that we need more of those also for these ongoing losses, which may be more tricky to memorize than single losses. And a related type of grief for non-finite loss is chronic sorrow. So this terminology is slightly tricky, because it can be easily mixed with what is called complicated grief or prolonged grief in grief research, and I'll come back to that. So chronic sorrow is non-pathological but persistent form of grief. So it's not the same as chronic grief, so this can easily be confusing. The descriptions of chronic sorrow in literature fit ecological grief very precisely. For example, expressions such as constant reminders or triggers, unavoidable periodic resurgences of intensity, and predictable and unpredictable stress points. Susan Roos is a major researcher of chronic sorrow. So also for my own experiences of ecological and climate grief, I found these expressions very descriptive and telling. And also speaking from my own experience over the years, I see the fluctuations and different phases and stages. So I've been sometimes in times when the constant reminders or triggers hit me harder than they do these times, for example. And I think that there is this possibility to have more balance in the fluctuations, but still there's gonna be waves and fluctuations, and I think it's very good to validate that socially. And then complicated grief, it means grief which is so difficult that some kind of support is very, very much in demand. and some would define this more as a clinical condition. So, but that can at best be interpreted in a positive sense of wanting to give support to people. And in the worst cases, it can lead to pathologizing and perhaps medicalizing healthy forms of grief. So there's a tricky discussion about this and definitions of it. So in the ecological sorrow article, I'm exploring some possible criteria for what might be complicated grief or prolonged grief in the context of ecological grief. And these are then now written in the image also. So if there's clearly prolonged and very intense grief reactions to a particular ecological loss, then that might count as prolonged ecological grief. So I think it's very normal that there will be intense grief reactions for a long time, but still, if, for example, the person is after 2 years still unable to talk about the experiences, that would be one sign of prolonged or complicated grief in this sense. So, and the second, long-standing and debilitating grief reactions to global ecological loss. So the first one was more about particulars, and the second one is more about the global situation. Of course, these resonate with each other and intermingle. Third one would be overly strong forms of anticipatory grief or mourning that might be called catastrophizing, for example. It can easily happen because the damage and threats are so intense. And fourth, cases where inhibited ecological grief can clearly be noticed. So inhibited grief means a situation where by all reason there should be grief, but the person doesn't seem to be experiencing it. And this is tricky because we need to be careful, I think, together with many grief counselors, of not doing normative presumptions that everybody should grieve the same way. Because that's not the case. People are different, situations are different, sorrows are different. But still, for example, if you lose a person who is very close to you and you don't show any signs of sorrow or grief, then there's a question about is there some kind of problematic dissociation from the whole experience? And that's what grief researchers have been exploring with the term inhibited grief. And I think that there can be instances of profound inhibited ecological grief in societies. That's a complex issue. And this is then linked with the framework of disenfranchised grief, which I have been mentioning several times already. There may be cases where the loss is not acknowledged. People tell you that, well, you know, is that a valid reason for sorrow? I don't think so, type of thing. There may be cases where the griever is excluded. For example, a young child is feeling grief because the local forest has been cut down, and people are saying, yeah, but you're only a child, so you can't understand how the adult world works. So that would be a case where the griever is excluded. And sometimes the relationship or kinship is not recognized. So I know that was a lot. Hope you are still hanging on there. Some possible questions for the second breakout group would be, how do I see the relationship between various temporalities and my or our ecological grief? Or more broadly, ecological grief in communities and societies, so the issue of temporalities. And second, if you want, you can also talk about this relationship between chronic sorrow and complicated or prolonged grief, which I try to open up a bit. There would be a lot more to say about that also. Does that sound reasonable and clear enough? I'm happy to see some nodding. So again, over to Laura for the technical stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Can you copy and paste those questions in the chat before we open up the breakout rooms? And then there is a question that came over on the Mentimeter, which says, can you just give a concrete example of the difference between non-finite loss and chronic sorrow, just so we're a little bit clear?
Yes, definitely so. Thanks for the question. So I think they are profoundly interconnected. Sorry for some of the typos in the questions in the chat. But technically, non-finite loss is the type of loss which is around And then chronic sorrow is the type of grief in response to that loss. But I also think that part of the reason why we have these two different terms and frameworks is that different grief researchers were working with each of them. And of course, there's been efforts to integrate that also. So technically, there might be non-finite losses which don't evoke heavy chronic sorrow, but that's often unlikely. But basically, the distinction between what's the type of the loss and what kind of grief follows. So that's the reason why there's two different terms. I hope that clarified at least a bit.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to go back into breakout rooms. You're going to have a different partner. The folks who didn't go into breakout rooms before, I tried to put you all in the same room so you can stay in the main room. For those of you who have joined us since the last breakout rooms, we're going to do about 3 minutes each person. Hopefully there's only groups of 2. If you end up in a group of 3, it'll be 2 minutes each. We'll try to pull you back in about 7 minutes, and you can discuss any of the material Panu has suggested up to, or taught about up to this point, or there will be some questions in the chat. So 7 minutes total. We'll pull you back in groups of 2 or 3. All right, we'll see you in a little bit.
Welcome back again to the main room. Could we do a brief check of how people are doing in relation to resources with the thumbs, for example? Like thumb down is that I'm totally exhausted already, and thumbs up is like I'm doing very well with resources. Could I ask for that kind of? Thank you. That gives important information. So moving on to part 3, the final part of the presentation, then there will be one more breakout group and then general Q&A. And we'll start with shattered assumptions. So some losses are so profound that they impact basic assumptions about the world and self. People then have in practice to engage in meaning reconstruction, and I'll come back soon to what that means. The ecological crisis can profoundly challenge people's meaning systems and also cause spiritual grief or grief with existential and spiritual dimensions. So the term shattered assumptions comes from Ronnie Janov Bullman, a noted trauma researcher who in her empirical studies observed that more profound traumas were generated if people's basic assumptions about life and world were either damaged or shattered by events. So that's what is meant by shattered assumptions, and in grief research this is also related to Colin Parkes and his framework of assumptive worlds. So that means that what do we think and believe the world to be like? And for people growing up in industrialized countries, sometimes, for example, there is the belief that the world is generally safe and benevolent, and then a traumatic event can damage those kinds of assumptions and beliefs. And in relation to the ecological crisis, there's such a big existential level that I think that there's a profound possibility that many kinds of fundamental beliefs and assumptions may be shaken, at least, if not shattered. And meaning reconstruction is related to our meanings in life. So in meaning research, often distinction is made between meaning in life or meanings in life. So meanings in what we do, what we are. So often close ones, the modern human world, meanings related to work or other kinds of life's purpose or just being. And then meaning of life is defined as the more sort of classical religious type of meaning of life in general, and sometimes the concept of purpose is also used in relation to that. So the changes in world are so profound that calls us, I think, to profound meaning reconstruction, at least in relation to standard meanings inherited from the fossil fuel-based industrial, often neoliberal capitalist economies. Well, there was a lot in that phrase. Sorry for that. And life world loss is a term I was exploring in the article to describe losses which are so holistic that they affect whole ways of living and all kinds of relations. And this may happen on various scales. Individual, cultural, and multi-species life worlds may be damaged or lost. And indigenous peoples have very often suffered this due to colonization. So whole life ways and life worlds have either been profoundly changed and damaged or completely lost. But this also applies to many, for example, countryside life worlds and practices of the 19th and early 20th century, for example. Those kinds of life worlds may be almost totally gone or then at least very strongly changed. So here's an image. By the way, Santtu Oja is the name of the young Finnish graphic designer who worked with me on these various images. So that's just a very simple example of how the individual, cultural, and interspecies or multi-species life worlds are intertwined. And here's another one where if we take the concept of life world loss and then think about tangible/intangible losses or ambiguous and non-ambiguous losses. So there's a sort of map into which various losses may be placed. So hopefully that might be helpful for someone sometime. So fundamental assumptions of the modern industrialized world are being questioned. Meanings in life are changing for many people, not only for the worse, as people such as Vanessa Andreotti and the Decolonial Futures Collective, for example, are exploring. There's many ethical demands which are intertwined with these kinds of deep changes. And Laura's book with Amy, for example, explores this in a very nice practical way, I think. But this situation can also evoke strong resistance, problematic nostalgia, sometimes intermingled with ecological nostalgia, and aggressive psychological defenses. So there can be what some have called inability to mourn. So I think that the ability collectively to be in touch with sadness and grief about changing world is actually politically and practically hugely important, because then the other way is towards trying to dissociate oneself or one's in-group from the grief and sorrow and the changing world, and that leads further away from reality. The old psychologist Robert J. Lifton was very wise in writing about these matters, for example. So the aim would be to collectively have constructive engagement in a process of meaning reconstruction. So that term comes from Robert Neymeyer, a grief researcher, basically living in the States, but often traveling worldwide to give workshops on grief counseling and other matters. And it's an existential constructivist grief theory. I know that's a bit jargony phrase, but anyway, so it's deep ranging, and personally I am very fond of it because I think it reflects reality. And there's narrative work included, so retelling who we are through the losses and in light of the losses and profound transformations. And in practice, grief counselors who engage in meaning reconstruction often literally ask people to tell the stories of the event which led to the sorrow, and then the wider background story, but also starting to tell the new story of who would we like to be or need to be in this kind of world. And as you can hear, this has links to many people writing about ecological grief and transformations and emotions. And Francis Weller is one and there would be a lot more to be named. So there is also the possibility of growth via grief. And this is a tricky subject because, of course, we want to avoid saying that grief would be mainly positive. There can be very strong pain included, but also potential for growth and transformation. And some frameworks in research about this are adversarial growth, that's a bit newer in popularity, and post-traumatic growth. There's more research about that, but some people think that it would be nice to have a general title which is not explicitly linked with trauma. And that's why, for example, I've been also using adversarial growth lately more than post-traumatic growth as a term. Honoring our pain for the world, echoing work that reconnects. So both the pain and the possible growth. Personally, I've been trying to explore this in process models of eco-anxiety and ecological grief. And I'll not go into this deeply now. I'll just show that there's a rather new website, ecoanxietyprocess.com, where we have videos about this topic. This is the model. So there's an intertwining of action, grieving, and distancing or self-care in the heart of it, and chronological aspects. And one application also is in relation to other animals. So this is from last spring, an article written with animal philosopher and activist Elisa Aaltola, where we take a look at 3 case examples: companion animal grief, wildlife grief, and farmed animal grief. So it can be a sort of intersectional, intertwining or mesh of various things where the transformation and grief process lies. So that was a lot of information. Once again, hopefully that sparks reflection. Some possible questions for the last breakout is, any thoughts about this topic of shattered assumptions and meaning reconstruction? What resonates for you? And what have I or we found helpful in relation to ecological grief? So some people would call this coping, for example. So if you wish, you can also discuss that, and that also builds a bridge towards the more general Q&A and discussion. So once again, hope you will have an insightful moment of sharing, and over to you, Laura.
Thank you. All right, this is our third and final breakout room. Same type of rules where we're going to try to be in dyads of 2 people for about 7 minutes. So 3 minutes each. Please be mindful of time. Would like to also let you folks know that we have an activity after this, so the event isn't done just after we come back from the breakout room. We'll be able to kind of apply some of this knowledge, and then I see that there are some questions coming through over in the Q&A. So before we go into the activity, we will have some time for Q&A. That being said, breakout rooms, 7 minutes total. Make sure there's room for everybody to talk. I'm going to open those rooms now. If you do not want to go into a breakout room, just stay here and I'll try to move people around until we get groups of 2. If there is a group of 3, please create space for that third person to talk. All right, we'll see you in about 7 minutes. Welcome back. We have a lot of really great questions, and looks like we still have a couple more seconds with the breakout rooms before everybody comes back. But Julie, are you willing to go over to the Mentimeter?
Yes, absolutely. I can read off the questions. Feel free to continue to put ones in there, or you can upvote the ones that you're also curious about. It should just be a little like icon. So without further ado, we'll start the question and answer portion. The first one I see here with an upvote is niche question, but can you share if any of the sites of memorial to lost landscape / ecology, specifically in Finland, or other rituals similar to the funeral for a forest?
Thank you for that question, and also for the other great questions in Menti. So glad to see those, and hope that the third breakout discussion was also useful. So in Finland, we have a pet cemetery or animal cemetery in Helsinki, and there's a memorial stone for animals who have suffered and died in animal testing. So that's one example of a stone memorial. And the last day of November, November 30, is the International Remembrance Day for Lost Species. So there's a website for Remembrance Day for Lost Species. And for the last 3 years, together with friends and colleagues, I've been organizing a moment of commemoration on that day near the stone in the pet cemetery, for example. And I think that annual marker days and rituals can be a very useful tool because they give structure. It may always take an effort to do a grief ritual or commemoration. Afterwards, my experience is that it often feels very relieving, sometimes even surprisingly relieving. But there is the threshold to be crossed, and sometimes structures and, of course, social company can help in that regard. Trebi Johnson was founding and leading the Radical Joy for Hard Times network, which has close connections with Good Grief network. I've noticed they have the tradition of having an earth exchange ritual moment near summer solstice. So that's another of these annual days. In Finland, we've been doing that also, but in various locations, sort of depending on which city or town we do it. And with the contemporary society, there's always a wounded place in nature to be found in whatever city you are in. So that's always a possibility. So we have some. It would be good to have more. Artists have been doing things which are on the borders between performances and rituals often. And for some people going into an art exhibition like the Finnish group IC98, who do sort of massive audio-visual things, often exploring environmental change. So that can be almost a sort of ecological grief ritual. So wanting to mention the topic of the arts also. I think I'll stop here for that question. Thanks for it.
Thank you, Dr. Panu. The next question I see here is, can you please talk a little bit more about narrative work and/or where I can go for further info on this with regard to the climate crisis?
Thanks for that also. And I had time to briefly read the questions during the breakout groups. So I'm gonna post 2 links to the chat now. So that's two sources. One is by Jeppe Graugard in this quite a nice handbook called Climate Change and Youth Mental Health Multidisciplinary Perspectives. And I know that that's not always the most easily accessible volume, but what he has been doing is in practice, I think, meaning reconstruction and narrative work, even though he doesn't use the concepts. The link is to blog post I made about meaning and eco-anxiety, where I'm applying some of the questions coming from Neymeyer and others in the meaning reconstruction tradition. And I think we would still need to work collectively on producing texts which are explicit applications of those methods. But for now being, I would recommend just to read some of Neymeyer's work. There's nice interviews online, for example. And then there's, of course, books about grief counseling and meaning reconstruction. But of course, narrative methods are used in work that reconnects. And actually, I'd like to throw the ball briefly to Laura. So what comes to your mind about narrative methods and meaning reconstruction and possible resources?
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I like eco-anxious stories that I saw you put in there. I mean, I think even a lot of the ones that have already been offered, and of course, Good Grief Network, we try really hard to form some narrative, some stories, some personal sharing about our experiences and how it lives through us. Um, I'll put it back to you guys because I know we have a lot of really great questions.
The next question I see here is, curious how you would categorize nihilism or doomerism. Is that a form of grief?
That's a great question also. And my observations is that sometimes nihilism or doomerism can be linked with unprocessed ecological grief or grief and other difficult eco-emotions which have been too much for the person, and then that leads to a certain direction. But please be mindful here. I'm not saying that all who take such a position are just, ignoring their ecological grief. There are some people who choose from a values perspective to practice nihilism, or what others call doomerism. And I think there's quite many variations of what gets called doomerism also. So in general, I would advocate for exploring also difficult emotions, including ecological grief. And I believe that that can help with some problematic bitterness, for example. And so that's always useful if it's possible to do it. And it's also possible to be a sort of collapse believing or collapse aware, if somebody might call it that, person without being in practice nihilist. So there's many versions. But perhaps it's good to briefly say here that in difficult times there's a psychological pressure for sort of certainty and chosen paths. And so this may result in people wanting to be optimistic and then sort of pressuring others to be optimistic also. Or as one option, it can manifest as people saying that they don't have any hope and pressuring others to not have hope either. And there's some interesting empirical research of non-hope as sort of conviction also. And I think it would be very important not to pressure others in these kinds of crucial existential takes. So I think we should respect people's approaches to life, and of course it's still possible to critically discuss the consequences of various positions. I hope I'm making sense here. It's a tricky topic, but.
Thank you for your answer. And I think we have time for one more question. Apologies that we could not get to all of the questions. But if you have any lingering thoughts after this presentation, feel free to contact us and we can try to get you those answers. What are the best ways to cope with some of these more abstract forms of loss and grief?
Thank you for that. And if I'm taking a look at the questions, so the question about non-finite loss is sort of related to these abstract forms of loss and grief also. And many farmers and ranchers are feeling profound solastalgia would be one word for place-based environmental distress and sadness and longing, and there's some empirical research of that also. So coping is a wide-ranging topic, and one good source is really the work that Good Grief Network and, for example, Laura's book is doing, with emphasis such as trying to learn to live with uncertainty. So and manage that somehow collectively better. It's a lot easier said than done. But for example, non-finite loss and chronic sorrow, it really requires us to not to try to control everything, because then it gets very difficult. But that being said, also people can learn to observe things which are potentially triggering heavier grief and distress. So a kind of situation selection, that would be a term coming from the emotion regulation framework. So sometimes we can save ourselves from some distress by just being mindful of what kinds of things are potentially causing us more trouble. But that being said again, the world is so full of potential triggers that we can't avoid all of them, but sometimes we can find ways to walk more mindfully in the midst of them. And social support and company is so essential, and that's why I think that spaces like this also are so important, and even better if we can meet live, but luckily at least we have Zoom. Thanks for the great question.
Thank you, Dr. Panu. It was wonderful to have your presentation and share your knowledge with us. And I'm really excited to introduce this next activity. I'll share my screen so you all can take a look together, and I'll let Laura introduce it for us.
Okay, so what we're going to carry you through in the next few minutes is a much, much bigger invitation than we have time for. So our proposal to you is that you screenshot this, or we will send an email out because there's been a lot of really great references and links that have gone through the chat or that have been mentioned. We'll send an email out tomorrow. But the idea here is just to get started with this. It's an invitation to draw your own grief map. All of our stories are different. How we came to an awareness of the predicament has been different. How we're going to move forward can be different. And so we want to etch out some time and space for you to reflect on where you've been and where you are and where you're going. So the first thing is to get a piece of paper, get a pen, and draw or write about the first time you felt that grief about our changing planet, that unshakable grief, that knowing that when you cross that barrier, you can't unknow anymore. Draw or write about that first instance. You'll have a few minutes. Okay, I invite you to wrap up your thoughts right now, acknowledging that this is a very inadequate amount of time and space to dig into such a profound moment for us. You can come back to this exercise. You can come back to this question. The second part, the second invitation we have is to draw or write about how grief lives with you today. How is grief a companion in your life? Draw it out, write it out. You'll have a few minutes. Okay, I invite you to wrap up your thoughts or your drawing about this second prompt. Again, acknowledging that we've asked you a very big question and only given you a short amount of time. You can come back to this. Okay, the third and final prompt for our grief map right now is to draw, write, explore about how we can weave grief with gratitude in a current moment, moving forward. How can we weave grief and gratitude, knowing that grief is often a feeling associated with what we love? How can we weave grief and gratitude? Okay, folks, ask you to wrap up your exploration. In a few moments, come back to the group. Okay, just a few more things before we close out. The first thing is we've done a lot of sitting, a lot of writing, a lot of talking about grief, and that lives in our bodies. And so, just an invitation to shake your body out. You can stand if you'd like, you can stay seated, but just give your body some space, some movement. Shake your hips, Carefully shake your neck, your head. Maybe add some really long exhales in there. We have some time for some closeout thoughts. And then in Good Grief Spaces, we usually end either with a poem or with some body movement. Today we'll opt for a poem. So some time for Panu and Julie to have some concluding thoughts and then a poem. And then some time for you to maybe shut your computer and give yourself a moment before you go back to your life. Allow the time and the space and some integration of what we just experienced here. I'll end my part just by saying that I'm really grateful for Penu's longtime work and heart in this space and really making grief accessible, giving us names to communicate about how we're feeling so that we might relate to other people feeling that. Julie, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Laura. And thank you all for taking this time today to be in this workshop. It was so enriching to learn with you all. I wanted to invite you to stay in touch. Like I said, if you have any questions, either for Good Grief Network or questions to pass along to Dr. Panu, feel free to email us. We also have a link tree where you can find more events just like this one, whether that's a workshop or you're interested in our sharing space or in our 10-step program. We have some of that available for you all, which you can also scan the QR code for. And wanted to open the space. Dr. Panu, if there's any closing remarks you'd like to make.
Mm. First of all, thanks everyone for being here. So really appreciating it and the possibility to together explore these things. Personally, I've been learning more and more somatic methods over the years, especially since the beginning of COVID-19. So that relates to also one of the questions in Menti. So very grateful for the presence of those methods also in this session and keeping up encouraging myself and everybody else to develop a daily and weekly practice of different things we can do with our bodies. I think it really helps, and that's also a closing thought for me. So everybody take care and hopefully see you again in sessions.
Thank you, thank you. All right, as promised, the poem. I put it in the chat if you want to follow along. It is by Rosemary Watola Traumer, who writes a lot about personal grief, but also collective grief. The poem's called For When People Ask. It says, I want a word that means okay and not okay. More than that, a word that means devastated and stunned with joy. I want the word that says, I feel it all at once. The heart is not like a songbird, singing only one note at a time, more like a Tuvan throat singer, able to sing both a drone and simultaneously 2 or 3 harmonics high above it. A sound, the Tuvans say, that gives the impression of wind swirling among rocks. The heart understands swirl, how the churning of opposite feelings weaves through us like an instant breeze, leads us worldlessly deeper into ourselves, blesses us with paradox, so we might walk more openly into this world so rife with devastation, this world so ripe with joy. Thank you, thank you, thank you for showing up. Thank you for your time and energy and heart. We'll see you next time.